Imagine waking up one crisp autumn morning, the familiar hum of the construction site filling the air. Frank Thompson, a man who has spent 3 decades building homes and nurturing dreams in his small Ohio town, has always been a pillar of strength and wisdom. At 65, with his weathered face and calloused hands, Frank believes his life's path is set in stone, until a new, younger manager arrives with a firm handshake and hidden agenda. What follows is a subtle but relentless battle, pitting Frank's hard-earned experience against corporate ambition. The tension between old-school craftsmanship and modern business tactics begins to unravel Frank's world. Decisions are made without him, protocols shift, and, before long, Frank finds himself facing a threat to the career he's built with such care. When accusations of neglect shake his foundation, Frank must navigate a storm of betrayal and self-doubt. But this is not just a story about loss, it's a tale of rebirth, resilience, and the lengths a man will go to rebuild his life when everything seems to crumble around him. What unfolds next will leave you on the edge of your seat, questioning who truly wins in the silent wars waged in the workplace. Will Frank's legacy survive, or will it be swept away by the winds of change? Dive into this gripping story of loyalty, perseverance, and one man's fight for redemption in the face of overwhelming odds. The sun had barely risen when Frank Thompson parked his old Ford F-150 at the Horizon construction site. At 65, Frank was a legendary figure in the small town of Millbrook, deep in the heart of Ohio. His wrinkled face and calloused hands told the story of a life spent building dreams, quite literally. On that autumn morning, as the sky turned shades of orange, Frank had no idea that his life was about to take a dramatic turn. He adjusted his worn yellow hard hat, a symbol of 3 decades of loyal service to Horizon, and walked toward the temporary office at the site. "Good morning, folks." Frank greeted the crew with his characteristic smile. The young apprentices and seasoned workers alike returned the greeting with genuine respect. To many, Frank was more than just a colleague, he was a mentor, a second father. As he organized the day's tasks, Frank noticed an unusual commotion near the administration trailer. A shiny black luxury car stood out against the dusty landscape of the site. Must be the new manager Mr. Horizon mentioned, Frank thought, feeling a twinge of unease. The car door opened, and out stepped a figure straight from a Wall Street commercial. Impeccable suit, gleaming shoes, and an expression that combined ambition with disdain. This was Maxwell Reed, 35, freshly graduated with an MBA from one of the country's top business schools. Frank took a deep breath and approached to offer a welcome. "Good morning, sir. You must be Mr. Reed." "I'm Frank Thompson, General Supervisor. Welcome to Horizon." Maxwell glanced at Frank's outstretched hand, hesitated for what felt like an eternity, and then shook it with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, yes. Thompson. I've heard a lot about you." That handshake sealed the beginning of a silent battle that Frank didn't yet realize he was about to fight. The days that followed were marked by subtle but significant changes. Maxwell began implementing new procedures, disregarding the decades of practical knowledge Frank and his team had accumulated. Meetings were scheduled without the veteran supervisor, and decisions were made without his input. Frank tried to remain optimistic, believing it was just a phase of adjustment. But he couldn't ignore the look of distrust Maxwell threw his way every time they crossed paths on the site. One afternoon, while overseeing the foundation of a new house, Frank heard his name being called. It was Lily, the secretary from the main office, with a worried expression on her face. "Frank, Mr. Reed wants to see you in the office." "Now." Frank's heart raced. In 30 years, he had never been summoned so abruptly. He wiped the dirt from his hands on his overalls and headed to the administrative trailer. Inside, Maxwell sat behind the desk, fingers interlocked, a cold smile on his lips. "Thompson, sit down, please." Frank complied, feeling the weight of all his 65 years at that moment. "Frank. Maxwell began, shaking his head. "We have a problem. It's come to my attention that you've been, let's say, neglectful with some safety protocols." The accusation hit Frank like a punch to the gut. "With all due respect, Mr. Reed, I've always prioritized safety above everything. In 30 years, we've never had a serious accident under my supervision." Maxwell slid a folder across the desk. "Then how do you explain these reports? Equipment not properly maintained, employees without up-to-date training. This is very serious, Thompson." Frank flipped through the documents, incredulous. This couldn't be right. He knew every bolt, every procedure. Something was very wrong. "There must be some mistake, Mr. Reed. I can explain each of these points." "There's no need," Maxwell interrupted, rising from his chair. "Frank, I understand you have a long history with Horizon. But times change, and we need to adapt. Consider this a formal warning. One more slip-up, and we'll have to reconsider your position here." Frank left the trailer feeling dizzy. The world around him seemed to spin. How had things come to this? He looked around the construction site, at the half-built houses, at the familiar faces of his crew. Everything he had helped build over decades now seemed to be crumbling around him. That night, when he got home, Frank couldn't hide his worry from Sarah, his wife of 40 years. "What's wrong, dear?" Sarah asked, noticing the lines of concern on her husband's face. Frank tried to smile, but failed. "Nothing, love. Just a tough day at work." Sarah didn't press, but her eyes told him she knew there was more behind those words. The days that followed were torture for Frank. Every move he made on site was watched, every decision questioned. He felt the pitying looks of his colleagues, the whispers that stopped when he approached. A week after the meeting with Maxwell, Frank received an unexpected phone call. It was Joe, an old client for whom he had built a house 5 years ago. "Frank, my friend. How are you? Listen, I'm thinking about expanding the house. Do you think you could stop by to discuss it?" That phone call felt like a ray of sunshine amidst the storm. Frank agreed immediately, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. On Saturday, Frank drove to Joe's house. Upon arrival, he was greeted with a warm hug and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. "Frank, you have no idea how happy I am to see you," Joe said, leading him to the back of the house. "You know, ever since you built this place, it's been the perfect home for my family. But now, with the third child on the way, we need more space." As Joe talked about his plans, Frank felt his love for the profession rekindle. He listened attentively, made suggestions, and sketched ideas on a napkin. For a few hours, he forgot all about the problems at the construction company. "Frank," Joe said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "there's no one I'd trust more to do this job. When can we start?" Frank's smile faltered. "Joe, I'd love to, but I don't know if I can. Things at Horizon are complicated." Joe frowned. "What do you mean, complicated?" "Frank, you're the best builder this town has ever seen. What's going on?" And for the first time, Frank opened up. He told Joe about Maxwell, the accusations, and the constant fear of losing the job he loved. Joe listened in silence, his face a mix of disbelief and indignation. Frank, that's absurd. You built Horizon just as much as Old Man Horizon did. They can't do this to you. Joe's words, though comforting, didn't change reality. Frank knew he was walking on thin ice and could fall through at any moment. The following Monday, Frank arrived at the construction site earlier than usual. He wanted to review some plans before the day officially began. As he approached the administrative trailer, he noticed the light was on. Curious, he walked closer, silently. The door was ajar, and voices inside reached his ears. He immediately recognized one of them, Maxwell, speaking on the phone. "Yes, sir. The plan is working perfectly. Thompson is practically out the door. In a few more weeks, we'll be able to replace him with someone more compliant." Frank felt the blood drain from his face. So that was it. It wasn't paranoia, it wasn't coincidences. Maxwell was actively working to push him out of the company. Staggering back, Frank felt the weight of 30 years of dedication collapse onto his shoulders. How could he fight this? How could he prove his innocence? In that moment, as the sun rose over the horizon, illuminating the construction site he knew like the back of his hand, Frank Thompson tasted, for the first time in his life, the bitter sting of defeat. But fate, as always, had other plans for Frank. And soon, he would discover that sometimes you have to lose everything to find a new beginning. The days following Frank's discovery were a blur of anxiety and doubt. Every morning, as he put on his Horizon uniform, it felt like he was donning armor for a battle he had already lost. Maxwell ramped up his tactics. Reports were lost, decisions were reversed without explanation, and little by little, Frank was sidelined from the most important projects. His protests fell on deaf ears, and even some of his older colleagues started avoiding his gaze in the hallways. One particularly difficult afternoon, Frank was overseeing the electrical installation in a new house when he heard a shout from upstairs. Rushing to check, he found one of his apprentices, Mike, on the ground, clutching his arm with a pained expression. "Mike! What happened?" Frank asked, already looking the young man over for serious injuries. I don't know, Mr. Thompson," Mike stammered, tears welling up. "I was installing the lights like Mr. Reed asked, but the scaffold, it seemed to give way." Frank looked up, and his heart sank. The scaffold was clearly unstable, set up incorrectly. He was absolutely sure he hadn't authorized that configuration. Before he could fully process the situation, he heard hurried footsteps coming up the stairs. Maxwell appeared, his face a mask of false concern. "What's going on here?" he demanded, looking from Frank to Mike. "An accident, Mr. Reed," Frank replied, trying to stay calm. "The scaffold wasn't secure." Mike fell, but it doesn't seem too serious. Maxwell narrowed his eyes. "Not too serious? Thompson, this is exactly the kind of negligence we discussed. How could you allow one of our workers to operate in such dangerous conditions?" Frank felt his blood boil. "With all due respect, Mr. Reed, I didn't authorize this scaffold setup. In fact, I'm sure that—" "Enough!" Maxwell cut him off, his voice echoing through the unfinished house. "This is the last straw, Thompson. I want you in my office in an hour. And bring your things." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank looked around, seeing the shocked faces of his crew, some avoiding his eyes, others looking on with pity. Mike, still on the ground, looked like he wanted to disappear. An hour later, Frank was sitting in front of Maxwell, 30 years of memories and accomplishments reduced to a small cardboard box beside him. Frank, Maxwell began, his tone dripping with false compassion. I understand this is difficult for you. But the safety of our employees is paramount. We can't risk another incident like today. Frank wanted to protest, to shout that this was a setup, that he would never put his men at risk. But the words died in his throat. He knew it was useless. You'll, of course, receive a fair severance package, Maxwell continued, sliding some papers across the desk. And Horizon thanks you for your years of service. Frank stared at the documents in front of him, the letters blurring before his eyes. 30 years. 30 years of dedication, of blood, sweat, and tears, ending not with a celebration, but with the signing of a cold, impersonal document. His hands trembling slightly, he picked up the pen. Each letter of his name felt like it weighed a ton. As he left the office for the last time, Frank felt the weight of his colleagues' stares. Some approached for a quick hug, others muttered words of comfort. But to Frank, everything felt distant, like he was watching the scene from outside his own body. The drive home that afternoon was the longest of his life. How would he tell Sarah? How would he explain that, after 3 decades, he had failed? That the future they had planned together was now in jeopardy? When he parked in the garage, Frank sat in the car for long minutes, his hands still gripping the wheel. Finally, summoning all the courage he could, he went inside. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Seeing her husband home earlier than usual, with a box in his arms, she knew instantly that something was wrong. Frank? What happened? He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, silent tears began to roll down his weathered face. Sarah rushed to him, wrapping him in a tight embrace. For a few moments, they stood like that, in silence, Frank's tears soaking into his wife's shoulder. I was fired, Sarah, he finally managed to say, his voice choked with emotion. 30 years, and it ended just like that. Sarah gently pulled back, looking into his eyes. Oh, Frank. I'm so sorry, dear. But we'll get through this together, okay? We always have. In the days that followed, Frank spiraled into depression. He spent hours sitting on the porch, staring into the distance, replaying every moment of the past few months in his mind, trying to figure out where he went wrong, what he could have done differently. The bills started piling up. The severance package, though seemingly generous at first, would barely cover their expenses for a few months. Frank found himself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, worrying about the uncertain future that awaited them. One morning, as he sipped his coffee, Frank heard the familiar sound of a construction truck rumbling down the street. The sound, once so common in his daily routine, now felt like a cruel taunt from fate. He rushed to the window, only to see the Horizon truck disappearing around the corner. That should be me, he muttered to himself, feeling a mixture of anger and despair welling up inside. Sarah, who had been quietly watching her husband, finally spoke. Frank, why don't you try starting your own construction company? You have the knowledge, the experience. Frank let out a bitter laugh. With what money, Sarah? And who would trust an old man who was fired after 30 years? The weeks dragged on. Frank tried picking up some temporary jobs, but nothing seemed to fill the void left by Horizon. Every hammer stroke, every wall he painted, only served to remind him of what he had lost. One night, after another frustrating day of job hunting, Frank found a bottle of whiskey tucked away in the back of a cabinet. He had never been much of a drinker, but in that moment, the idea of dulling the pain was too tempting to resist. Sitting alone in the dark living room, Frank took sip after sip, letting the memories flood over him. He thought about the day he first walked into Horizon, young and full of dreams. About the first houses he helped build, the pride he felt watching families move into homes he had helped create. And then, like a slow-motion film, he relived the past few months, Maxwell's cold stares, the unfair accusations, the moment he was forced to sign his own termination papers. "I should have fought harder," he muttered to himself, his voice thick with alcohol and emotion. "I should have. That's how Sarah found him hours later, passed out on the couch, the empty bottle beside him. Her heart broke at the sight of the strong man she had known for so long reduced to this. The next morning, with a pounding headache and a bitter taste in his mouth, Frank dragged himself to the kitchen. Sarah was there, a steaming cup of coffee waiting for him. "Frank," she began, her tone soft but firm, "this can't go on. You're losing yourself, and I can't just stand by and watch it happen." Frank opened his mouth to protest, but Sarah raised her hand, silencing him. "I know you're hurting. I know what happened was unfair. But the Frank I know, the man I married, wouldn't give up like this. He would fight." Sarah's words hit Frank like a slap. He looked down at his hands, calloused from decades of hard work, and felt a pang of shame. What had happened to him? "You're right," he finally said, his voice hoarse. I've lost my way, Sarah. I don't know who I am without Horizon." Sarah stood up, pulling something from a drawer. It was an old photo album. She opened it, revealing pictures of Frank throughout the years, his first day at Horizon, the first house he supervised, celebrations with the crew. "This," she said, pointing to the photos, "this is who you are, Frank. A builder, a leader, a man who never gave up. Horizon may have taken your job, but they can't take that from you." Frank looked at the pictures, feeling something stir inside him. A spark of determination that had long been dormant. "What do you say?" Sarah continued, a twinkle in her eye. "We go for a walk. There's a new coffee shop downtown. They say the owner is new to town, came from New York to start over here." Frank hesitated for a moment, but something in Sarah's look convinced him. "All right," he agreed, "I guess some fresh air won't hurt." As they got ready to leave, Frank had no idea that this simple walk was about to change the course of his life once again. Fate, as always, had surprising plans for Frank Thompson. The doorbell chimed softly as Frank and Sarah entered the new coffee shop. The aroma of freshly ground coffee and warm bread filled the air, bringing a sense of comfort that Frank hadn't felt in weeks. The place was cozy, with rustic wooden tables and plants hanging from the ceiling. Black and white photographs of old Millbrook buildings adorned the walls, creating a nostalgic atmosphere. While Sarah chose a table by the window, Frank made his way to the counter to order. That's when he noticed the man. Behind the counter, tall, middle-aged, with a warm smile and sharp eyes. "Good morning. Welcome to New Beginnings. What can I get for you?" the man asked, his accent hinting at his New York roots. "2 coffees, please," Frank replied, his eyes wandering over the photographs on the wall. "These pictures, they're beautiful. Do you know the story behind them?" The man smiled, following Frank's gaze. "Actually, yes. I spent the last few weeks researching Millbrook's history. Fascinating how this little town grew, isn't it? Especially the construction boom in the 90s. Frank felt a pang in his chest. That boom, he had been part of it. "Yeah, those were interesting times," Frank murmured, more to himself than to the barista. The man watched him for a moment, a curious expression on his face. "You know, there's one photo here that always intrigued me," he said, pointing to an image of a house under construction. This one. The technique used, it's unique. I've never seen anything like it in New York. Frank looked at the photo and felt his heart race. He knew that house. More than that, he had built it. It's a local technique, Frank explained, his voice gaining a bit of life. We developed it to deal with the harsh winters around here. See how the foundation is slightly raised? That prevents damage caused by the ground freezing and thawing. The barista stared at him, fascinated. Incredible. You seem to know a lot about construction. Do you work in the field? Frank hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. I used to, he finally answered. For 30 years. But now. The man nodded understandingly. I see. You know, I'm starting over too. Michael Reynolds, he introduced himself, extending his hand. Former Wall Street executive, now coffee shop owner in a small town. Life's funny, isn't it? Frank shook the offered hand, feeling an instant connection with this stranger. Frank Thompson. Former construction supervisor, now, well, I'm still figuring that part out. Michael smiled, a gleam of recognition in his eyes. Thompson? From Horizon Construction? Frank nodded, surprised. You've heard of it? Of course. When I decided to move here, I did my research. Horizon is practically a local legend. And your name, Frank, came up in almost every major project over the past 30 years. Frank felt a mix of pride and sadness. It was strange hearing someone talk about his career with such respect, especially after the humiliation of the past few months. Michael seemed to notice the shift in Frank's demeanor. Listen, he said, lowering his voice, I'm about to close for lunch. How about you and your wife join me? I'd love to hear more about your construction experience. Frank hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who was watching the scene with an enigmatic smile. She nodded encouragingly. Sure, Frank replied, feeling a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It would be a pleasure. The next few hours passed in a blur. Frank, Sarah, and Michael sat at a table in the back of the coffee shop, their coffee cups constantly refilled as they talked. Frank found himself sharing stories from his years in construction, the challenges, the victories, the innovations he and his team had introduced. As he spoke, he felt a familiar energy returning, that sense of purpose that had long abandoned him. Michael listened attentively, asking insightful questions and sharing his own Wall Street experiences. The conversation flowed naturally, as if they were old friends catching up after years apart. It was Sarah who finally brought up the elephant in the room. Frank, she said softly, why don't you tell Michael what happened at Horizon? Frank felt his stomach drop. But something in Michael's understanding look encouraged him. And so, for the first time since his firing, Frank opened up completely, sharing not just the facts, but also the pain, frustration, and sense of injustice that had consumed him. When he finished, a heavy silence hung over the table. Michael drummed his fingers thoughtfully on his empty cup. Frank, he finally said, have you ever considered starting your own business? The question caught Frank off guard. Well, Sarah suggested it. But with what money? And who would trust me after what happened? Michael smiled, a determined glint in his eyes. What if I told you I could help with both problems? Frank and Sarah exchanged confused looks. What do you mean? Frank asked. Michael leaned forward, his voice filled with enthusiasm. You see, Frank, I didn't come to Millbrook just to open a coffee shop. I'm looking to invest in promising local businesses. And after our conversation, I'm convinced that a construction company led by you would be exactly that. Frank felt his heart race. Are you serious? Absolutely, Michael replied. I have the capital, you have the experience and the reputation. Think about it, Thompson Construction. A business that values quality, innovation, and, above all, integrity. Sarah squeezed Frank's hand, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Frank, this is incredible. Frank felt overwhelmed. Just a few hours ago, he had been at home, wallowing in self-pity. And now the universe seemed to be offering him a second chance. I don't know what to say, he stammered. Michael smiled understandingly. You don't have to decide right now, Frank. Think it over. Talk to Sarah. But know that the offer stands. I believe in you and what you can do. As they walked home that afternoon, Frank felt like he was floating. For the first time in months, he could see a future ahead of him, a bright future full of possibilities. What do you think, Sarah? He asked, squeezing his wife's hand. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with pride. I think, Frank Thompson, it's time you showed Millbrook and yourself what you're truly capable of. Frank nodded, feeling a determination he hadn't felt in years. The road ahead would be challenging, he knew that. But with Sarah by his side and this new opportunity in front of him, Frank was ready to face whatever came his way. As the sun set over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Frank Thompson made a silent promise to himself. This wouldn't just be a story of a new beginning, but a story of triumph. And he was determined to write it, brick by brick, dream by dream. The days following Frank's meeting with Michael were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. After a night of deep discussions with Sarah, weighing the pros and cons, Frank decided to accept Michael's proposal. The idea of starting from scratch was daunting, but the prospect of building something truly his own was even more exhilarating. A week later, Frank found himself sitting in a makeshift office in his garage, surrounded by blueprints, material samples, and a growing pile of legal documents. True to his word, Michael had provided not only the initial capital but also valuable contacts to help establish the new business. Thompson Construction, Frank murmured to himself, admiring the freshly designed logo on one of the documents before him. It felt surreal to see his name there, representing not just a new business, but a fresh start, a new chapter in his life. The first few months were a roller coaster of emotions and challenges. Frank quickly realized that building a company from the ground up was very different from overseeing projects at an established firm. There were licenses to secure, insurance to obtain, suppliers to negotiate with, and most importantly, clients to win over. Frank's reputation in Millbrook was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, many people knew and respected him for his work at Horizon. On the other hand, rumors about his dismissal had spread, and some questioned whether he was still trustworthy. This was when Frank fully understood the value of his partnership with Michael. The former Wall Street executive not only provided the capital, but he also brought a business perspective that Frank lacked. Frank, Michael said during one of their weekly meetings, we need to change the narrative. Your firing isn't a stain on your record, it's the catalyst for something bigger. It's the story of a man who, after decades of building dreams for others, decided to build his own. Those words resonated deeply with Frank. With Michael's guidance, he began presenting himself not just as a builder, but as a visionary, someone who understood Millbrook's unique needs and was committed to creating homes that reflected the community's values and character. Slowly, things began to change. The first major project for Thompson Construction came unexpectedly. Joe, the client who had contacted Frank about an expansion just before his dismissal, heard about the new venture and didn't hesitate to hire him. "Frank," Joe said, shaking his hand firmly, "there's no one I'd trust more to do this. You built my house once, and now you're going to help it grow with my family." That first project was a turning point. Frank poured all his heart and experience into it, determined to prove not just to others but to himself that he was still capable of creating something extraordinary. As Joe's home expansion took shape, other residents of Millbrook began to take notice. People stopped to admire the work, commenting on the attention to detail and the quality of construction. Frank was frequently on site, personally overseeing every step and always willing to explain the process to curious passers-by. One afternoon, as Frank was on the scaffolding, applying the finishing touches to one of the new walls, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. Turning around, he saw Mike, the young apprentice who had been injured on that fateful day at Horizon. "Mr. Thompson," Mike said nervously, I wanted to apologize for what happened at Horizon. I should have told the truth, that it was Mr. Reed who asked me to use that unstable scaffolding." Frank climbed down, feeling a mix of emotions. "Mike, you have nothing to apologize for. You were young, you were scared. It wasn't your fault." Mike looked as if he was on the verge of tears. "But because of me, you lost your job. And now, well, I heard you started your own company. I was wondering if maybe there was a chance I could work for you? I promise to do my best." Frank was touched by the young man's sincerity. In that moment, he saw not just an opportunity to help someone, but also to pass on the knowledge and experience he had accumulated over the years. "You know, Mike," Frank said with a smile, "I could use a reliable apprentice. How about starting on Monday?" Mike's face lit up with a beaming smile. "Really? Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I won't let you down, I promise." That moment marked another turning point for Frank. He realized that Thompson Construction wouldn't just be about building homes, it would be about building people, creating opportunities, and strengthening the community. As the months went by, the reputation of Thompson Construction grew. Projects began to pile up, and Frank found himself in a position where he needed to expand his team. He made it a point to hire locally, giving preference to young apprentices and experienced workers who, like him, had been left behind by a changing industry. One day, while Frank was reviewing projects in his new office, now a proper room in the center of town, no longer his garage, Sarah walked in with a curious expression on her face. "Frank, darling, someone's here to see you," she said, a hint of mystery in her voice. Frank looked up, intrigued. "Who is it?" Sarah stepped aside, revealing a familiar figure standing in the doorway. It was Mr. Horizon, the former owner of Horizon Construction, now retired. "Frank, my boy," Mr. Horizon said, his voice thick with emotion. "May I come in?" Frank stood up, surprised and a little apprehensive. "Of course, Mr. Horizon. Please, have a seat." The old man settled into the chair across from Frank's desk, his eyes scanning the office with admiration. "You've built something incredible here, Frank. I always knew you had the potential for more." Frank felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, sir. It means a lot to hear that from you." Mr. Horizon sighed deeply. "Frank, I'm here to apologize. I should have seen what Maxwell was doing. I should have stepped in. When I found out what had happened, well, let's just say Maxwell is no longer at Horizon." Frank sat in silence for a moment, processing the information. Part of him wanted to feel satisfaction at knowing Maxwell had been fired, but he realized that the resentment that had once consumed him had faded. "Mr. Horizon," Frank finally said, "what happened was difficult, but look where I am now. Maybe, in some strange way, everything happened the way it was supposed to." The old man smiled, tears welling in the corners of his eyes. "You've always been a better man than me, Frank. And a better builder, too. In fact, that's why I'm here. Horizon has been struggling since you left. We're losing contracts, and the quality isn't what it used to be. I'd like to propose a partnership. Horizon and Thompson Construction, working together. What do you think?" Frank felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. It was a tempting offer, a chance to return to the place that had been his home for so long. But as he looked around, at the office he had built with his own hands, at the Thompson Construction logo on the wall, he knew his answer. "Mr. Horizon, I appreciate the offer. Truly. But Thompson Construction is more than just a business to me. It's a dream, a promise I made to myself and to this community. I can't walk away from it now." Mr. Horizon nodded, a mixture of disappointment and pride on his face. "I understand, Frank. And I respect your decision. You've built something special here, something that goes beyond bricks and mortar. You've built a legacy." After Mr. Horizon left, Frank stood by his office window, gazing out at the town he loved. Millbrook was changing, growing, and Thompson Construction was at the heart of that transformation. In that moment, Frank felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Sarah, who had never stopped believing in him. For Michael, who had seen potential where others saw failure. For Mike and all the young apprentices who trusted him to guide them. And, surprisingly, even for Maxwell, whose betrayal had inadvertently opened the door to this new journey. The road ahead would still be long, Frank knew that. There would be challenges, setbacks, difficult days. But now, he faced them not as a defeated man, but as a man reborn. A man who had learned that sometimes everything must fall apart before something truly extraordinary can be built. As the sun set over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Frank Thompson smiled. He was ready for the next chapter, ready to keep building, not just houses, but dreams, communities, and a bright future for all those who believed in him. And so, brick by brick, dream by dream, the story of Frank Thompson, the resilient builder, continued to be written, not just in the structures he raised, but in the hearts of the people whose lives he touched. 10 years had passed since that fateful day when Frank Thompson was fired from Horizon Construction. 10 years since he, with the help of Michael and the unwavering support of Sarah, took the first step toward building not just a new company, but a new legacy. Today, Thompson Construction is more than just a successful construction company in Millbrook. It's a symbol of resilience, integrity, and innovation. The houses and buildings erected by Frank and his team dot the town's landscape, each telling a unique story of perseverance and dedication. Frank, now 75, is still a constant presence at the construction sites. His hair, once gray, is now completely white, but his eyes still shine with the same passion and determination they had a decade ago. He is no longer just a builder, he is a mentor, a community leader, a man whose story inspires everyone around him. The company that started in a garage now occupies an entire building in the heart of Millbrook. Frank's office, on the top floor, offers a panoramic view of the town he helped shape. The walls are covered with photos, not just of completed projects, but of people. Families standing in front of their new homes, apprentices receiving their certifications, teams celebrating major milestones. On a sunny spring morning, Frank is in his office, reviewing plans for Thompson Construction's latest project, a community center that will serve as a trade school, offering free training to young people interested in construction and related fields. A soft knock on the door interrupts his thoughts. It's Mike, the same young apprentice from years ago, now a project manager at Thompson Construction. "Mr. Thompson," Mike says with a smile, "it's time. Everyone's waiting." Frank nods, standing up with a slight groan. The years may have slowed his movements, but they hadn't dampened his spirit. He follows Mike to the elevator, heading down to the ground floor where a crowd is eagerly waiting. Outside the building, a large canvas covers something on the sidewalk. The crowd, composed of Thompson Construction employees, clients, friends, and family, parts to make way for Frank. Sarah is there, her eyes shining with pride and love. Next to her is Michael, now a full partner in the business and one of Frank's closest friends. Even Mr. Horizon is present, leaning on a cane but with a genuine smile on his face. Frank stands next to the covered plaque, feeling the weight of all the eyes on him. He clears his throat, his voice thick with emotion. 10 years ago, he begins, "I thought my journey as a builder had come to an end. I was wrong. It was only the beginning of something much bigger." He pauses, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. Faces of people whose lives he had touched, whose dreams he had helped build. Thompson Construction isn't just mine. It's ours. To every one of you who believed in me, who worked by my side, who trusted us to build your homes and your futures, this moment is for you. With a nod from Frank, Mike and another employee pull the canvas, revealing a bronze plaque mounted on the building's wall. It reads, "Thompson Construction, Building Dreams, Raising Futures. Founded by Frank Thompson, 2024. Dedicated to the Millbrook community and all who dare to start again." The crowd erupts in applause. Tears fill the eyes of many, including Frank's. Sarah steps forward, intertwining her fingers with his. "You did it, love," she whispers. "You built something truly extraordinary." Frank squeezes Sarah's hand, feeling a surge of gratitude and fulfillment wash over him. He thinks of all the houses he's built over the years, all the lives he's touched. He thinks of the journey that brought him to this point, the highs and lows, the victories and defeats. In that moment, Frank Thompson understands that his true masterpiece isn't the buildings he's constructed, but the legacy he's built. A legacy of perseverance, of second chances, of believing in the transformative power of hard work and integrity. As the sun shines over Millbrook, illuminating the streets Frank knows so well, he smiles. The future stretches out before him, full of possibilities. And he knows, with absolute certainty, that no matter what lies ahead, he will continue building dreams, hopes, and a better tomorrow for everyone. Because Frank Thompson isn't just a builder of houses. He's a builder of futures, an architect of hopes, a man who has proven that with courage and determination, it's possible to build an extraordinary life out of the ruins of despair. As the commemorative plaque unveiling ceremony comes to an end, Frank finds himself surrounded by familiar and new faces, all eager to share their stories and express their gratitude. Among the crowd, he spots a face he hasn't seen in years, Maxwell Reed. The former Horizon manager, now visibly older and with a look of regret, approaches Frank hesitantly. "Mr. Thompson," he begins, his voice trembling, I don't know if I have the right to be here, but I had to come. I needed to apologize for what I did all those years ago." Frank looks at the man before him, remembering the anger and resentment he once felt. But now, all he feels is compassion. "Maxwell," Frank says softly, "what happened back then shaped us both. Without it, I may have never found my true path. There's nothing to forgive." Maxwell's eyes fill with tears, and Frank, in a gesture of reconciliation, extends his hand. The two men share a brief embrace, symbolizing not just forgiveness, but the transformative power of time and perseverance. As the afternoon progresses, the celebration moves inside the Thompson construction building. In the spacious lobby, panels display the company's history, from the first renovated house to its most ambitious recent projects. One panel, in particular, catches the attention of many visitors. Titled Project Rebirth, it highlights an initiative Frank launched 5 years ago, a rehabilitation and training program for former inmates, giving them a second chance through learning trades in construction. Standing before the panel, Frank meets Maria, one of the program's first participants. Today, she is a skilled carpenter and team leader at Thompson Construction. "Mr. Thompson," Maria says, her voice thick with emotion, "I'll never have enough words to thank you. You didn't just give me a job, you gave me a new life." Frank smiles, placing a hand on Maria's shoulder. "You did the hard work, Maria. I just opened the door. You chose to walk through it." In another corner of the lobby, Michael is engaged in lively conversation with a group of young entrepreneurs. In recent years, the partnership between Frank and Michael has evolved, leading to the creation of a mentorship program for local startups focused on sustainable construction technologies. Frank's vision goes far beyond building houses, Michael explains to the group. He understands that we're building the future, and that means embracing innovation and sustainability. As night falls and the guests begin to disperse, Frank still has one final surprise. He gathers his core team, including Mike, Maria, and a few of the most promising apprentices, into his office. "You are the future of Thompson Construction," Frank begins, his voice filled with emotion. "And that's why, on this very special day, I want to announce that I'm transferring the majority of the company's shares to you." A stunned silence falls over the room, followed by gasps of surprise and excitement. "But Mr. Thompson," Mike protests, "the company is your life." Frank smiles, looking out the window at the city he helped shape. "No, Mike. You are my life. This community is my life. Thompson Construction isn't just mine, it belongs to everyone who helped build it. And now, officially, it will belong to you." He turns to the group, his eyes shining with determination. "But don't think I'm retiring. We still have a lot of work to do, many dreams to build. I'm just ensuring that the legacy we've created will continue long after I'm gone." As the news sinks in, Frank feels a gentle hand on his shoulder. It's Sarah, her eyes filled with love and pride. "You've always known how to build the future, my love," she whispers. Later that night, long after the last guest has left and the city lights have dimmed, Frank and Sarah sit on their porch, gazing up at the stars. The city below them is a patchwork of lights, each representing a home, a family, a dream fulfilled. "You know, Sarah," Frank says softly, "when I was fired from Horizon, I thought my life was over. Little did I know it was just the beginning." Sarah squeezes his hand, smiling. "You've always been a builder, Frank. But what you've built goes far beyond houses and buildings. You've built hope, opportunities, second chances." Frank nods, feeling a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. "And we're not done yet," he says with a smile. "Tomorrow is a new day, with new challenges, new dreams to build." As the couple watches the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight begin to paint the sky, Frank Thompson knows that his journey is far from over. Each new day brings the promise of more lives to touch, more dreams to fulfill, more futures to build. And he is ready, with his tools in hand and his heart full of purpose, to continue his most important work, building a better world, one brick at a time. I hope you enjoyed this story full of twists and emotions. If you liked it and want more exciting narratives like this, don't forget to give it a like, activate the Tinkerbell, and subscribe to the Stories Life channel. Here, each story is a new adventure, and we are always ready to surprise you. Also leave your comment on what you thought of the story and suggestions for future narratives. See you next time.